Welcome to the Bedtime Book of History. Now please gently close your eyes. Entrust the full weight of your body to the softness beneath you. Feel each breath, like a gentle tide, carrying away the fatigue of the day, allowing your thoughts to slowly settle. Tonight, we will not chase the hurried steps of time, nor will we attempt to solve the riddles of history. This will be an immersive companionship. We will become a silent travel partner, following a distant soul. From the first time he gazed upon an unfamiliar sky, through his storms and his sunshine, until he falls peacefully asleep beneath the starlight. This is not about knowledge, but about feeling. A whisper in your ear, guiding you into a tranquil dreamscape. Now let everything go. Are you ready? Our journey is about to begin in the year 376 AD. A mysterious nomadic force known as the Huns swept across the north shore of the Black Sea like a storm. Their devastating offensive forced the Goths, who had lived there for generations, into a desperate struggle for survival. Hundreds of thousands of Goths, warriors, women, children, and the elderly, gathered with their families on the north bank of the Danube River. What they saw on the opposite shore were the banners of the Roman Empire. In their eyes, Rome was not an enemy, but a sanctuary, a beacon of civilization. They sent envoys to humbly petition the Eastern Roman Emperor, Valens, to allow them to cross the Danube as federati allies, to become subjects and soldiers of the empire. They were willing to surrender their weapons and offer their children as hostages in exchange for land and food. This was a mutually beneficial proposal. Rome could gain a massive source of high-quality troops to replenish its border legions, which were increasingly depleted by plagues and civil wars, while the Goths could secure a space for survival. However, a healthy system can transform external pressure into internal strength. A decaying system, on the other hand, turns opportunity into crisis. Rome at that time was already a vast machine plagued by bureaucracy and corruption. The Roman officials tasked with receiving the Goths saw an opportunity for profit. They embezzled the food supplies that were meant for the Gothic refugees and instead sold them dog meat at exorbitant prices. The going rate was said to be 1 dog for 1 Gothic slave. They abducted Gothic children to be sold as slaves throughout the empire, yet were lax in collecting their weapons. Dignity was trampled, promises were broken. Hunger and despair spread like wildfire through the Gothic camps. With their greed and short-sightedness, the Roman officials had single-handedly turned a group of potential allies into sworn enemies. The conflict finally erupted in the summer of 378. Enraged, the Goths rose up and began to plunder the fertile lands of the Balkan Peninsula. Emperor Valens, leading the elite corps of the imperial army, intended to annihilate this group of ungrateful barbarians once and for all. On August 9th, 378, the Battle of Adrianople commenced. The Roman heavy infantry legions, exhausted from the scorching heat and a long march, hastily launched an attack on the Goths' defensive wagon laager. The Goths, especially their elite heavy cavalry, seized the moment of chaos in the Roman formation and launched a devastating charge from the flank. That day became one of the darkest in Roman military history, comparable to the catastrophic defeat at Cannae. Emperor Valens was killed in battle, and 2/3 of his eastern field army were annihilated. It was the first time since the age of Hannibal that a Roman emperor had been killed by barbarians on the battlefield. The shadow of Adrianople loomed over the Roman Empire thereafter. Militarily, it proved that the traditional Roman heavy infantry phalanx was struggling against the Germanic-style heavy cavalry charge. But politically, its impact was even more profound. It exposed the first fatal flaw of the Roman system, an arrogance rooted in a sense of civilizational superiority and the institutionalized bad faith that resulted from it. Rome no longer had the capacity, nor the will, to fairly and effectively integrate the external groups pouring across its borders. It only wanted to exploit them, unwilling to grant them the status and respect they deserved. This use and discard strategy was bound to lead to betrayal and backlash. It is said that a 10-year-old Alaric was among the Gothic crowds on the banks of the Danube. He may not have witnessed the Battle of Adrianople firsthand, but he must have heard the story of blood and fire countless times from his elders. He must have felt the humiliation of being deceived and abandoned by the civilized world, and he must have witnessed his people reclaiming their dignity through force of arms. This childhood imprint would follow him for the rest of his life and shape his fundamental logic in dealing with Rome. Rome's promises could not be trusted. The sword in his hand was the only guarantee. After Adrianople, the new emperor, Theodosius I, adopted a more pragmatic policy. He made peace with the Goths, allowing them to live autonomously within the empire and fight for Rome as allies. The Goths got the land and peace they desired, and Rome got the army it desperately needed. A seemingly win-win situation was formed. The young Alaric grew up in this context, and with his outstanding military talent, he began to distinguish himself among the Goths. His life's trajectory seemed to be heading toward becoming a high-ranking Roman general. He was about to enter the Roman system that he both admired and distrusted, to experience its glory and its decay firsthand, and ultimately to be forged and burned by it. Under Theodosius the Great, Alaric and his Gothic warriors became an indispensable force in the Roman army. They were organized into independent foederati units, commanded by their own leaders, and retained their native fighting styles. For the young Alaric, this was both an opportunity and a profound cultural shock and learning process. The first time he entered a standard Roman military camp as a foederati commander, the shock was indescribable. The Gothic camps he knew were haphazardly built around wagons and tents, filled with the clamor of families and tribal disorder. The Roman camp before him, however, was a perfect geometric city. Straight roads, standardized barracks, deep trenches, and towering wooden palisades. Everything exuded a sense of cold, efficient, impersonal order. He saw a Roman centurion, with just a grapevine staff, command 100 soldiers to move as one, in perfect unison. He saw a Roman engineering corps build a bridge across a stream or erect a defensive wall several kilometers long in a single day. This was the power of Rome, the ability to forge countless individuals into a vast, efficient, and predictable collective machine. Alaric was both in awe and wary of this. He began to absorb everything like a sponge. No longer content to be a Gothic chieftain who won by sheer bravery, he began to systematically study Roman military thought. He consulted with friendlier junior Roman officers, learning how to read tactical maps, how to organize a marching column of 10,000 men to avoid ambushes, and how to calculate the necessary supplies and baggage for a long-distance raid. He was particularly interested in the Roman logistics system, discovering that the foundation of the legion's ability to campaign across vast distances lay not in the soldiers' swords, but in the mules of the supply trains and the grain in the storehouses. This was a complex system of engineering unimaginable to a tribal warrior. However, in this process of learning and integration, Alaric also felt the invisible wall with increasing clarity. This wall was the second fatal flaw of the Roman system: asymmetrical loyalty and trust. On the battlefield, when facing a common enemy, the Goths' ferocity could often earn them the temporary respect of their Roman comrades in arms. A Gothic warrior who saved a Roman centurion in battle might get a sincere thank you or even a flask of good wine. But once the battle was over and they returned to camp, an invisible barrier based on identity would reappear. Alaric experienced this firsthand. He was once publicly praised by a Roman general for a brilliant flanking maneuver that turned the tide of a minor border skirmish. But at the victory banquet that night, he and the other Gothic chiefs were seated in a corner far from the main table, using cruder pottery. He could hear the aristocratic Roman officers at the main table conversing in elegant Latin about philosophy, poetry, and their villas in Rome, occasionally casting curious and contemptuous glances his way, as if observing a collection of tamed, exotic beasts. They were us, and Alaric and his countrymen were forever them. This distinction between us and them was evident in every aspect of life. Gothic troops were always the last to receive new equipment. Their winter blankets were always the thinnest, and their pay was often delayed or embezzled. While Roman legions were stationed in warm, safe cities, the Goths were often deployed to the most remote and dangerous frontier outposts. Rome demanded that they fulfill the most perilous duties but was unwilling to grant them equal rights. Loyalty here became a one-way street of demands. This long, trying process in the crucible reached its climax and shattered Alaric's personal faith at the Battle of the Frigidus River in 394 AD. A usurpation had occurred in the Western Empire. A rhetorician named Eugenius, propped up by the powerful general Arbogast, had declared himself emperor. Theodosius the Great led the Eastern army to crush the rebellion. Alaric and his more than 20,000 elite Gothic warriors, serving as allied troops, formed the vanguard of this army. Before the battle, Alaric had attended Theodosius's war council. Based on his intuition for the terrain and his judgment of the enemy's deployment, he had suggested to the emperor and his Roman generals that they use the cover of night and forest to send an elite force to outflank the enemy, creating a pincer attack with the main frontal assault to minimize casualties. However, his proposal was immediately dismissed by an arrogant Roman general. "A barbarian's trick is beneath us. A Roman victory must be proven by crushing the enemy from the front with the magnificent legionary formation." Although Theodosius did not directly criticize Alaric, he adopted the more conventional, or rather more familiar to Roman sensibilities, tactic, a frontal assault. In that moment, Alaric understood that his military genius, however brilliant, could not penetrate the wall of Roman elite arrogance. His advice had been discounted from the start simply because of his Goth identity. Theodosius's final tactical deployment was simple and brutal. He placed Alaric's Gothic troops at the most dangerous, forwardmost position of the entire battle line, making them charge the enemy's fortified positions of shields and spears. The first day of battle was hell for the Goths. Alaric fought at the front, his long hair flying in the wind, his axe dripping with blood. He saw his childhood friends pierced by Roman javelins. He saw venerable tribal elders have their horses' legs cut from under them, falling into the dust to be instantly overwhelmed. They surged toward the enemy lines like a tide and retreated like a tide, leaving behind a dense carpet of Gothic bodies. According to historical records, nearly 10,000 Gothic warriors fell permanently after the first day's fighting. That night, in the Gothic camp, there were no cheers of victory, only suppressed wails and quiet prayers for the dead. Alaric patrolled the camp, seeing young, exhausted faces, the light in their eyes dimmed. He profoundly understood the true meaning of the word federati. It did not mean equal partners, but expendable strategic buffers, or useful cannon fodder. They were irrigating the Roman emperor's great cause of unification with Gothic blood. He said to his men gathered around him, "We win victories for the Romans, but what do we get in return? Endless contempt and senseless sacrifice. We have shed more blood than the Tiber has water, yet they dismiss us with a few empty words of praise. We cannot go on like this." Despite the heavy losses, thanks to a fierce north wind that suddenly blew on the second day, seen as a miracle by Christians at the time, Theodosius ultimately won the Battle of the Frigidus River and reunited the empire. But for Alaric, the victory was bitter. He had traded the lives of 10,000 Gothic warriors for a clearer understanding of the Roman system. He saw that no matter how hard he tried to think and fight like a Roman, in the eyes of the Roman elite, he and his people would always be outsiders, always be pawns to be sacrificed. Shortly after the Battle of the Frigidus River, Theodosius the Great died. On his deathbed, he divided the vast empire between his two young sons. The east went to Arcadius, and the west to Honorius. The unity of the empire lasted only a few months. And Alaric, the decorated Gothic general from the Battle of the Frigidus, awaited his due reward, a high-ranking Roman military position commensurate with his achievements, such as Magister Militum, Master of the Soldiers. This was more than just a title. It was an official recognition of his value and that of all the Goths who had bled for the empire, a symbol of their formal integration into the Roman power structure. However, what he received was silence and neglect. The empire's two new masters, and their respective courtiers, were too busy vying for power. No one cared about the demands of a barbarian chieftain. In that moment, the crucible phase of Alaric's life ended. He was about to transform from a Roman general desperate for acceptance into a challenger who would take what he was owed by force. The death of Theodosius was the last straw. A strong central authority had vanished, replaced by two weak emperors and two mutually hostile courts. The Rome that Alaric had hoped would fairly reward his loyalty no longer existed. His demand, a high-ranking military post, was kicked back and forth between the eastern and western courts like a ball. The eastern regent, Rufinus, and the western regent, Stilicho, both saw him as a potential threat or a pawn to be used, but never as a partner to be taken seriously. This was the third and most central flaw of the Roman system. The priority of internal political struggles always superseded the effective management of external threats. The entire imperial elite was trapped in a fatal short-sightedness. They would rather see the empire suffer losses than see their political rivals gain an advantage. For Alaric, this meant that the path for upward mobility through normal channels was completely blocked. When a system no longer provides reasonable opportunities for advancement and reward to its capable and contributing members, those members have only two choices: either suffer in silence and be marginalized, or seize what they are owed by unconventional means. Alaric chose the latter. In 395 AD, after being acclaimed as Rake's king by his people, Alaric launched his first major military campaign. Leading the surviving Gothic veterans from the Battle of the Frigidus and a large number of new followers, he left their settlements on the lower Danube and marched south, sweeping across all of Greece. This campaign is depicted in traditional histories as a savage raid. But if we analyze Alaric's behavior, we find a clear political logic behind it. His goal was not destruction. He bypassed the heavily fortified city of Constantinople, having neither the ability nor the desire to attack the Eastern Roman capital. He targeted cities that were poorly defended but rich in symbolic value and wealth. His objectives were very clear: economically, to acquire enough wealth and supplies for his followers. As a leader, he had to constantly maintain the loyalty and morale of his army with victories and spoils. This was an army without state logistical support. Their survival depended on living off the land. Politically, to exert immense pressure on the Roman court. Every raid was a strong signal sent to the emperor and regents in Constantinople. You can no longer ignore me. My destructive power is my bargaining chip. This was a classic case of armed negotiation. Alaric wrote his demands on the map with his sword. Ultimately, the Eastern Roman court yielded. Unable to defeat Alaric militarily, they had no choice but to return to the negotiating table. They granted Alaric the title he had coveted: Magister Militum per Illyricum, Master of the Soldiers for Illyricum. On the surface, Alaric had succeeded. He had traded force for status. Illyricum was an important province, straddling the border between the Eastern and Western empires, and possessed important military arsenals. Becoming its legitimate military commander meant he could legally use Roman resources to arm his own troops. But in reality, this was just a political ploy by the Eastern Roman courtiers. They had thrown this hot potato into the lap of the Western Roman Empire, making him a pawn to counterbalance the Western regent, Stilicho. Alaric was once again being used as a tool, but he accepted the position. It at least gave him a legitimate identity and a base to rest and gather strength. His life had now entered a new phase. He was no longer just a military chieftain, but a geopolitical player maneuvering between the two major political factions of Rome. His rival would be the most powerful military figure of the era, Stilicho. A decade-long saga of two titans was about to unfold on the soil of Italy. Stilicho, a figure as complex and tragic as Alaric, lived a life that was a grand tragedy on the stage of a crumbling empire. He sought to single-handedly turn the tide, but was ultimately consumed by the very system he tried to save. He himself was of Vandal and Roman descent, an outsider who had risen to the pinnacle of power through military merit. He married the niece of Emperor Theodosius and became the guardian and de facto ruler of the Western Roman Emperor, Honorius. Stilicho's office was not in Rome, the city steeped in senatorial aristocracy and ancient tradition, but in Ravenna, a city in northeastern Italy surrounded by marshes. Easy to defend, it was also a political island, isolated from the true pulse of the empire. Every morning, when Stilicho awoke in his residence, he faced not a battle map, but a far more complex web woven from countless power relations and conflicts of interest. His primary challenge was the hostility from the Roman Senate. These pure-blooded Roman aristocrats, with their inherited lineage and vast estates, looked down on him as a half-barbarian from the depths of their souls. In their eyes, Stilicho's hold on power was itself a symbol of Rome's decline. A typical Senate meeting would often unfold like this. Stilicho would propose a bill to increase taxes to strengthen the frontier defenses. He would present precise data and rigorous logic, detailing the pressure on the Rhine and Danube frontiers and the urgent need for troop replenishment and fortification construction. However, the response he received was often not rational discussion, but a senior senator, perhaps a representative figure like Quintus Aurelius Symmachus, rising to his feet. He would recall the glory of Rome in the Republican era with florid and empty rhetoric, then, with a shift in tone, would ask sarcastically, "Why should the wealth of we Romans be used to support barbarian armies whose loyalty we cannot even be sure of? Perhaps this money is merely a tool for certain individuals to buy the loyalty of their own kind." Every such confrontation drained Stilicho's political capital. He deeply understood the empire's fragility, knowing that Rome could no longer rely solely on citizen soldiers to maintain its vast borders. Hiring barbarian allies was the only viable option. But this pragmatic choice was twisted by his political enemies into an act of letting the wolf into the sheepfold. He was filled with a sense of loneliness and exhaustion, defending the property and lives of a class that distrusted and even hated him. He was more Roman than any of them, but his unchangeable Vandal blood was a sin he could never wash away. It was precisely this outsider status that made Stilicho the only one in the entire Roman high command who truly understood Alaric's motives. He knew Alaric did not want destruction, but institutional recognition and a space to live, goals remarkably similar to his own youthful ambitions. But his hands were tied. As the guardian of the Western Roman Empire, he had to stop Alaric's invasion. In 401 AD, after gathering sufficient strength in Illyricum, Alaric made a fateful decision to invade Italy. Stilicho demonstrated his brilliant military talent. He quickly redeployed elite troops from the Rhine frontier and Britain to defend Italy. In the battles of Pollentia and Verona in 402 AD, Stilicho twice dealt heavy blows to Alaric's army at Pollentia. Stilicho launched a surprise attack while the Goths were celebrating Easter, their guard down. The battle was exceptionally fierce. Alaric's wife and children were captured. At Verona, Stilicho used brilliant flanking tactics to trap Alaric's army in a river bend, cutting off all escape routes. Alaric was at his wit's end. However, after gaining a military advantage on both occasions, Stilicho made a decision that the Roman Senate could not comprehend. He did not annihilate Alaric's remaining forces but chose to make peace with him and allow him to withdraw his army from Italy. After the Battle of Verona, his second-in-command, a pure-blooded Roman general, emotionally questioned him. "General, Alaric is a turtle in a jar. Why not press on and destroy him, ridding Rome of this menace?" Stilicho, watching the dust raised by Alaric's retreating army in the distance, replied calmly, "To kill Alaric, we would have to sacrifice at least 10,000 more of our elite soldiers. And those 10,000 soldiers are what I need to defend all of Gaul. What do we gain by killing him? A Goth's head and an empty Rhine frontier. But by letting him live, letting him return to Illyricum, he becomes a thorn in the side of the Eastern Emperor. In the future, when we need a sword to point at Constantinople, Alaric's sword will be sharper than any we could forge ourselves. War is not slaughter. It is the continuation of politics." Stilicho's considerations went beyond mere military victory to geopolitical calculation. He understood military cost. Annihilating Alaric and his tens of thousands of Gothic warriors, even if possible, would inevitably come at a heavy cost to his already stretched elite forces. These troops were the last capital for defending the entire Western Roman Empire. Asset value, Alaric was a double-edged sword. He was both a threat and a potentially valuable asset. Stilicho keenly realized that in a future conflict with the Eastern Empire, Alaric and his battle-hardened army could be a trump card in his hand. Systemic problem. Stilicho knew that killing one Alaric would not solve the fundamental problem. As long as Rome's policy of integrating barbarians failed, and as long as the pressure on the imperial borders persisted, a second and third Alaric would appear. Simple military annihilation was a temporary fix, not a cure. Stilicho's strategy was an upgraded version of using barbarians to fight barbarians. It was co-opt and utilize. He attempted to bring this destructive force, Alaric, back into the Roman orbit and use it for his own purposes. In the years that followed, a delicate balance was maintained between Stilicho and Alaric. They were rivals but also potential allies. Alaric withdrew to Illyricum, biding his time. Stilicho used this precious period of peace to miraculously defeat another, much larger invasion of Italy in 406 AD by a group of Ostrogoths led by Radagaisus. This victory pushed Stilicho's prestige to its peak. But it was this very victory that accelerated his downfall, because in order to defend Italy, he had stripped the entire Rhine frontier of its defenses. On the last night of 406 AD, the Rhine River froze over. Hundreds of thousands of Germanic tribesmen, Vandals, Alans, Suebi, and others, crossed this natural barrier and poured into Gaul. Gaul, one of the richest provinces of the Western Roman Empire, was plunged into centuries of war and fragmentation. When the news reached Ravenna and Rome, panic and anger engulfed everything. The Roman senators did not see Stilicho's achievement in defending Italy. They only saw the fall of Gaul. They blamed everything on Stilicho. The suspicion and hatred towards him reached their zenith. Stilicho's chess game was coming to an end, and Alaric's fate was now tightly bound to that of his only true rival. In 408 AD, the Eastern Roman Emperor Arcadius died. Stilicho saw this as a golden opportunity to intervene in Eastern affairs, perhaps even to reunite the two halves of the empire under his own regency. For this grand plan, he needed a powerful ally. He once again thought of Alaric. He reached an agreement with Alaric, promising him 4,000 pounds of gold to keep his army on standby, ready to march east together. This decision was the final straw that broke Stilicho's back. In Ravenna, the capital of the Western Empire, a court conspiracy led by the courtier Olympus was in full swing, plotting a coup. They relentlessly whispered poison into the ear of the young Emperor Honorius, painting a terrifying picture. Stilicho, the Vandal, was paying a huge sum to Alaric, the Goth. Their goal, they claimed, was not for the emperor, but to usurp the throne, perhaps even to pass it to Stilicho's own son, who had imperial blood. This was a classic identity politics attack. They exploited the deep-seated fear and distrust of barbarians in the hearts of the Roman elite, twisting all of Stilicho's rational, strategic decisions made in the national interest into personal ambition. Emperor Honorius, a weak young man raised in the seclusion of the palace, whose greatest passion in life was raising pet chickens, and who knew nothing of politics or war, believed the slander. On August 22nd, 408, Stilicho was lured into a trap and executed. The last pillar of the Western Roman Empire did not die on the battlefield, but at the hands of the very emperor he had sworn to protect. The death of Stilicho was an irreversible turning point in the history of the Western Roman Empire. It marked the death of Rome's last vestiges of reason and pragmatism. But the tragedy did not end there. To consolidate their power, the coup leaders instigated a massacre of barbarians throughout Italy. Tens of thousands of women and children, the families of Gothic, Vandal, and other Germanic soldiers serving in the Roman army, were mercilessly slaughtered. Many of these soldiers were decorated veterans who had fought to defend Rome under Stilicho. When they heard the news of their families being massacred, their loyalty instantly turned to bitter hatred. Over 30,000 elite barbarian soldiers, who had once served the Roman army, defected en masse. They crossed the Apennine Mountains and joined Alaric's camp. At that moment, Alaric was already furious for not having received the 4,000 pounds of gold promised by Stilicho. Now, he saw tens of thousands of pairs of eyes burning with vengeance. His army swelled to an unprecedented size, his military power reached its peak, and more importantly, he gained something he had never had before, an irrefutable legitimacy for revenge. The death of Stilicho, followed by the massacre, completely burned the last bridge of negotiation between Alaric and Rome. Rome, that vast and arrogant system, had personally killed the only man who could check Alaric, and then, with a bloody slaughter, had delivered to Alaric the finest troops and the most righteous cause for war. The irony of history could not be more profound. Alaric once again marched his army south and invaded Italy. This time, there was no Stilicho to stop him. His target was the capital of the world, Rome. When Alaric's army appeared before the walls of Rome, the city's inhabitants were thrown into panic and confusion. They could not understand why the imperial army had not come to their rescue. They did not know that after Stilicho's death, the military command system of the Western Roman Empire had been paralyzed. Alaric did not immediately storm the city. He chose to lay siege. He took control of all the ports on the Tiber River, cutting off the food supply on which Rome depended for its survival. This once again proved that his primary goal was not destruction, but negotiation. He was using the entire city of Rome as his greatest bargaining chip. Within the city walls, a miniature Roman world was experiencing a slow suffocation. The different social classes experienced the disaster in vastly different ways. In the villas of the senatorial aristocrats, like the Senator Gaius Anicius, a fictional representative figure, who owned a mansion on the Esquiline Hill, there was initially scorn for the siege. In their dining rooms adorned with exquisite mosaics, they enjoyed the stored grain from their own estates, savored Spanish wine, and laughed at the ragged barbarians outside the city. They firmly believed that the emperor in far-off Ravenna would soon send a large army to sweep away this rabble. But as the days passed, there was no news of relief forces. The granaries dwindled. Anicius grew anxious. He reduced the number of banquets and ordered his steward to have the rations for the slaves. The high walls of his villa could block out the noise of the city, but they could not block out fear. He began to hear terrible rumors. The price of grain in the city had skyrocketed. A gold coin could no longer buy a few pounds of flour. People were beginning to starve to death in the plebeian districts. The eyes of his most trusted slaves now held a disturbing glint he had never seen before. The world he had built on wealth and privilege was crumbling from its foundations. In the insulae, high-rise apartment buildings, where the common people lived, the scene was much more direct and brutal. These crowded, filthy buildings housed Rome's ordinary citizens, artisans, and small merchants. Their livelihood depended entirely on the bread from the government's daily free distribution of bread and circuses, panem et circenses. When Alaric cut off the supply lines on the Tiber, the grain distribution stopped. Panic spread like a plague. A black market emerged, where a small piece of moldy bread could cost as much as an ordinary person's annual income. Social order began to collapse. Neighbors fought over scraps of food. The air was filled with despair and the stench of decaying bodies. The people's anger, initially directed at the Goths outside the city, soon turned towards the nobles who still lived in luxury within. At night, they whispered curses against the senators who were hoarding grain and the emperor in Ravenna who was indifferent to their fate. It was in this soil of desperation that the idea that opening the gates might be better than starving to death began to quietly take root. In the Lateran Palace, the residence of Pope Innocent I, another struggle was taking place. As the most prestigious leader in Rome at the time, Pope Innocent I took on a sacred duty that transcended religion. He opened the church's granaries and distributed the reserved grain to the poorest citizens. But for a city of 1 million people, this was just a drop in the bucket. He prayed day and night, but also soberly recognized that prayer alone could not save Rome. He went from one aristocrat to another, trying to persuade them to donate their private grain stores, but with little success. He also presided over an unsettling religious ceremony. In a Rome where Christianity had become the state religion, he tacitly allowed some pagan senators to revive ancient rituals of sacrificing to the gods to repel the enemy. This showed that in extreme circumstances, even the most steadfast faith had to make compromises with reality. Finally, a delegation consisting of Pope Innocent I and several senators was allowed to leave the city to negotiate with Alaric. When they arrived at his camp, they saw not the chaotic barbarian encampment they had imagined, but an orderly, heavily guarded military fortress. Alaric received them in his simple command tent. The Roman envoys, dressed in magnificent purple-bordered togas, spoke to Alaric with their characteristic Roman arrogance, saying that if he did not withdraw, tens of thousands of citizens within the city would take up arms and fight. Alaric listened, then replied with his famous, dark, and laconically Gothic wit. The thicker the hay, the easier it is mown. When asked for his terms, Alaric's price was all the gold, silver, movable property in the city, and all barbarian slaves. The envoys asked in terror, "Then what will be left for us?" Alaric stared at them and said, word for word, "Your lives." Finally, he added, "Go back and tell the Senate this is not extortion. It is compensation for the blood my people shed on the banks of the Frigidus, for our families slaughtered in Italy, and for the treaty broken by Stilicho. This is a bill that is 15 years overdue." In the end, the Romans capitulated. They scoured the entire city, even melting down some of the temple statues, to gather 5,000 pounds of gold, 30,000 pounds of silver, and large quantities of silk, leather, and pepper, which they gave to Alaric in exchange for lifting the siege. This was the first siege. Alaric took the ransom, kept his promise, and withdrew his army to Tuscany in northern Italy. He was still waiting. He was waiting for Emperor Honorius in far-off Ravenna to come to the negotiating table and give him a final, permanent solution. His core demands had never changed: land, food, and status. This was a barbarian leader's last attempt to lead his people from being allies of the empire to becoming settlers with legal land and status within the empire. It was, in essence, a final request for amnesty from the system. However, the court in Ravenna was controlled by Olympus and his gang of short-sighted politicians. They rejected all of Alaric's demands. They could not let go of their pathetic Roman pride to engage in an equal dialogue with a barbarian chieftain. They even launched small-scale sneak attacks on Alaric's army during the negotiations. This act of bad faith completely enraged Alaric. He launched a second siege. This time, he propped up a Roman senator named Priscus Attalus as his puppet emperor, trying to bypass Honorius by establishing a new regime to achieve his political goals. But this plan also failed. Attalus was equally unwilling to grant land to the Goths. Alaric soon deposed him. After 2 years of a cycle of sieges, negotiations, betrayals, and shattered hopes, all of Alaric's patience was finally exhausted. He realized that this Roman system had completely lost its ability to self-correct and make rational decisions. It was like a catatonic patient, unable to respond effectively to any external stimulus. Negotiating with it was meaningless. In August of 410 AD, he laid siege to Rome for the third time. This time, he no longer sought negotiations. When the Salarian Gate was opened, the Goths who poured into the city were filled with long-suppressed anger and despair. They plundered the city for 3 days. The churches were spared, and the killing was relatively restrained, but the city's wealth was completely looted. More importantly, the myth of Rome's invincibility was shattered forever. This so-called sack of Rome was less a barbarian victory than a funeral for a civilization. It buried Alaric's last hope as an insider reformer. He had tried every means to become a part of Rome, but Rome had pushed him away time and time again. In the end, he could only respond to the system's ultimate betrayal in the most extreme way. Sacking Rome did not bring Alaric final peace. He led his people, along with his most important trophy from the city of Rome, the sister of Emperor Honorius, Galla Placidia, and continued south. His next target was the rich province of North Africa, Rome's granary. He wanted to find a true home for his people there. But fate, it seemed, had one last joke to play on him. As his fleet prepared to cross the Strait of Messina, a sudden storm destroyed most of his ships. The way south was cut off. Alaric was forced to turn back. Shortly thereafter, in Cosenza in southern Italy, the Gothic king who had made the entire empire tremble died suddenly of an illness, at the age of only 40. His followers held a funeral for him in an epic Roman fashion. They conscripted thousands of slaves to divert the Busento River, built a tomb for their king in the dry riverbed, and buried him along with the treasures plundered from Rome. Then, the river was returned to its original course, submerging the entrance to the tomb. Finally, all the slaves who had participated in the construction of the tomb were put to death. The burial place of Alaric has remained a secret ever since. His successor eventually led the Goths north into Gaul and finally established the Visigothic kingdom in Spain, which lasted for several centuries. They finally obtained what Alaric had sought his entire life, a land of their own. But that was after the concept of the Western Roman Empire had all but ceased to exist. Looking back at Alaric's life, we see a clear chain of logic. Systemic bad faith. The Adrianople incident taught the Goths how cheap Roman promises were. Asymmetrical loyalty. The Battle of the Frigidus River showed Alaric the cannon-fodder nature of being an ally. Blocked upward mobility. After the death of Theodosius, the rigidity of the Roman court cut off his hopes of obtaining status through normal channels. Complete collapse of trust. The death of Stilicho and the subsequent massacre completely erased the last possibility of peace. Alaric was not a born destroyer. He was an exceptionally talented military commander and statesman, a leader trying to find a space for his people to survive in a rapidly changing world. His life was a long game of chess with the Roman system. He tried to play by the rules, but the rule makers kept breaking them. He tried to integrate into the system, but the system, due to its own rigidity, arrogance, and infighting, ultimately rejected him. In the end, it was not Alaric's greed that sacked Rome, but Rome's own systemic collapse. The story of Alaric is a profound parable about identity, institutional trust, and the clash of civilizations. It tells us that when a powerful system loses its ability to self-innovate, to integrate fairly, and to keep its promises, its most dangerous enemies are often not the challengers from without, but the insiders it has created, nurtured, and ultimately betrayed. The fire that ignited in 410 AD illuminated not just the ruins of the city of Rome, but the irreversible fate of a great civilization in its twilight. And Alaric, the misunderstood barbarian of history, was the loneliest of watchmen, the one who rang the death knell of the empire.